International trade is the subject of this module, and we're going to do two things in this module. First, we're going to conceptually give what trade is and then talk about barriers to trade. And then we're going to specifically focus on agriculture and look at some of the barriers to trade in agriculture. There are two readings associated with this module, both of them by Douglas Irwin. You see those listed right there. Both of them are linked to our Compass website, or there's links to them from our Compass website, and both give some historical perspectives on trade. As the name implies, international trade is between two countries. In my example here, country A and country B. Country A may send to country B corn. Country B may send back to country A manufactured products. We then get concerned about barriers to trade, which I indicated here by that big black line. So are there items that are predicting or are preventing trade from country A to country B? One of the first items that come to mind are tariffs, which are fees or taxes placed on the imports into the country. For example, country B could put a tariff on imports of corn from country A. It could be $1 per bushel fee or tax, whichever you prefer. Those fees, those taxes, those tariffs inhibit trade. It would make the goods from country A be less competitive to those manufactured in country B, which may in fact be the reason for the tariff in the first place. So, tariffs, fees put on the imports from one country into the other, are a barrier to trade. One of the first things that trade agreements typically try to eliminate are tariffs. After that, though, there still are other barriers to trade. Some of the non-tariff barriers include import licenses. You must get a license before you import. Import quotas. You can only import so much of the good. Subsidies, and we'll come back to this because this is important to agriculture, and that could be subsidies to export, encourage export. So country A could put a subsidy on any good that goes to country B. So for our corn going into country B, they could give a 50-cent credit on taxes. So that might be a subsidy to export to country B. Or there could be a subsidy to the industry. And again, we'll come back to that to agriculture. Voluntary export restrictions, embargoes. Embargoes would be the ability, or you just embargo, say no more trade between country A and country B. And it could be, for example, this happened a couple years ago. Russia had a wheat yield shortfall. They embargoed any exports. That would obviously be a barrier to trade. We then also have currency devaluations, and this is another one that impacts agriculture and one that you will often hear associated with China right now. And then their debate goes on whether or not those occur, but currency devaluations make goods from one country more expensive to import into the other country. So all of those things are non-tariff trade barriers. Free trade is the absence of trade barriers, and we'll note right now that that is a matter of degree. So we could have no tariffs but substantial non-tariff barriers. That's freer trade than having tariffs in place, or potentially could be freer. So there are matters of degree in free trade, but free trade is what you would generally view it as the absence of trade barriers. Over time, and this is where your readings come in, we have had various countries practice various trade policies. And prior to the late 1700s, a lot of countries practiced policies that encouraged exports but discouraged imports. That, as you will see in the readings by Irwin, was a policies, if you will, called mercantilism. And these arose during the 16th and 17th century, and they essentially favored, again, as I said before, a balance of trade which promoted exports and discouraged imports. You see these policies still in place today, less so than before, but in general, the idea was that a country that exported more would accumulate more, in those days, gold, and that would make it wealthier. Those theories that led to mercantilism were attacked by Adam Smith in a book that was published in 1776 called The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. That book promoted the idea of free trade, and Adam Smith built a case that free trade was the appropriate policy for both countries, and most economists accept that idea today. There were historical supporters of unrestricted free trade, Adam Smith being one of those, Ricardo being another, and Herschel Olin being another. All of those names will come up later in this course. Why free trade? The essential argument behind why free trade is good for economies is that it allows specialization. So country A can specialize in what it's best in, and country B can specialize in what it is best in, and that will increase efficiency. It also reduces government costs because of export subsidies, so we don't make those outlays, and then import restrictions which may benefit domestic industries. Who gains when trade barriers do exist? The answer is those that protected industries. So if we have an industry within a country that is protected, that industry would benefit from the trade barrier. That would include labor or the individuals working in those industries. Several examples of trade barriers and who benefit from them in recent times were the auto industry. The ethanol industry had trade barriers when it initially started, and the sugar industry still has trade barriers. So the sugar industry still does benefit from those trade barriers. Some of the challenges to free trade, or that are mentioned as why we don't want free trade, is number one, we want to protect infant industries. By that we mean industries that are just beginning, that are not mature, and may not, for whatever reason, be able to compete with other industries until they get their houses in order. So one of the challenges or reasons why we wouldn't want free trade is to protect infant industries. Second reason is to protect other countries from manipulating prices. If we have trade policies out there, other countries potentially could manipulate prices within countries and within other countries. Whether or not that happens is a question that often arises, but it is an argument or challenge to free trade. The final challenge that you often hear is to protect strategically important industries. For example, food is often mentioned as a strategically important industry. Most countries often want to be self-sufficient in food. Other strategically important industries might be the airline, or not the airline industries, but the airplane manufacturing industry, aviation industry, or any industry that feeds into defense. Those are often mentioned as industries that we want to protect or so that we could put trade barriers in place. One of the impacts of free trade is that some industries go to other countries. And that is often a concern. We've seen that here recently um, with the election of Donald Trump and his concerns with trade. Did our manufacturing abilities leave the U.S. because of unfair trade in in his way of stating it? So the fact that industries leave does happen and is often a concern and is a current concern in the United States. Over time, particularly since World War II, there have been emphasis on reducing or lowering trade barriers. And that really began after World War II because it was believed if we could lower trade barriers and have more trade between countries, we would have less chance of war. That is, as countries depended on one another more through trade, we would see less chance that they would go to war because that would be counterproductive. The major agreement that started the free trade movement since World War II was the Generalized Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, and you will see that in a number of readings coming up. GATT is a concern or meeting that generalized agreement on trades and tariffs. We have also seen the introduction of other more regional agreements. One of the prime examples is NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. GATT and the regional agreements have largely reduced and eliminated tariffs as a trade barrier. However, there still exist trade barriers, and there are two important to agriculture, and we're going to talk about those now, and you will still see those coming up today. The first one of those is sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And basically, those are food safety, animal health, or plant health measures that are put in place by a government. And in general, they would be put in place to protect their consumers in that country. However, if sanitary and phytosanitary measures differ between countries, you could argue that the difference, and in particular if one country had stricter, so to speak, SPS or sanitary and phytosanitary measures, that would limit trade. Now we've seen a movement to encourage international standards, but still allow countries to have their own. And the more those are standardized across the countries, the less trade barriers that those differences could cause. Again, the goals of that of these sanitary and phytosanitary measures is to help governments protect consumers, but if we could encourage international standards, we could avoid using those as protections in disguise. Under GATT, there were three cases in which SPS measures were seen to violate GATT. One was a beef hormone case, in which U.S. had less stringent beef hormone regulations than the EU, and the EU regulations were seen as a trade barrier. There are also cases in Australian salmon and Japanese agriculture. The other type of trade barrier are technical barriers to trade, and these differ slightly from sanitary and phytosanitary standards. These are other technical requirements. The one that comes to mind or comes up often in agriculture is labeling. And GMO labeling is one that's often discussed. EU does require labeling, whereas the United States does not. Another one is country of origin labeling of meat. In the U.S., at one time required that all imports of meat be labeled with their country of origin. Technical barriers to trade have to have a reason, valid reason, to exist. There has to be some reason why those things are valuable. That is often in the eye of the beholder, but those are one of the items that often come up again in agriculture. Another barrier of trade that may not be immediately evident are subsidies. And this came up in a GATT case in Brazil. Brazil sued the United States over cotton. Both Brazil and U.S. are cotton producers and are exporters. So both U.S. and Brazil export cotton. Cotton production was, take out is and put was, subsidized in the United States in such a way as to encourage production. And that underlined part of that sentence is important. A country can subsidize an industry, but it must not encourage production. Some of the ways you could introduce subsidies that would not encourage production is tie it directly to land and not to output. But in any case, at that point in time, cotton was subsidized and it did encourage production. It was technically through the loan rate. Brazil challenged this case on subsidies and it won. As a result of that, the U.S. did change the cotton subsidy program that is contained in the Farm Bill. But again, subsidies can act as barriers to trade. To summarize here, free trade, and we've seen a movement towards free trade since World War II, may be not doing so much anymore, or more recently we've seen movements away from free trade. But overall, free trade is a matter of degree, and in agriculture, we do have some non-tariff barriers that are a concern. Those include sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, and agricultural subsidies. We have two review questions at the end of this chapter. One of them deals with the subsidy, that is this one. The second one is a technical barrier to trade. So take a shot at answering those two questions.